Hey guys, welcome back to Fiction Flux. Hope you're all doing well. Now let's get into it. She had known since she was 7 years old. Not the full version, not the complete picture with all the documentation and the weight of it, and the specific historical truth that would eventually reorganize everything she understood about herself. Just the feeling. The specific quality of knowing something was underneath, without knowing what the underneath was. She had written about it in Notebook 1. She had been 7 years old, and she had written in the careful handwriting of someone who was already taking the documentation seriously. I think there is something my mother is not telling me. I don't know what it is. It doesn't feel like a bad secret. It feels like a heavy one. She had drawn a star. She had been 7. She had already had the star system. She closed Notebook 1 and put it away, and went back to being 7 years old in a world that did not yet know what was coming. Okay, we need to start from the very beginning. Because you cannot understand this story, the specific weight of it, the way it built toward the moment when Tamura Shigaraki learned something that Izumi Midoriya did not yet know, the way that knowledge became the most significant leverage point in a war that was already enormous, without understanding what came before the beginning. Before Izumi Midoriya, there was Itachi Uchiha. Not in the hero world, not in Japan, in a different world, a different system, a different architecture of power and sacrifice, and the specific cost that extraordinarily capable people paid when the systems they operated in required more of them than any person should be required to give. He had been a shinobi, the most gifted of his generation, possibly the most gifted of several generations. The kind of person who made the systems around him nervous with their capability, because capability at that level was simultaneously the most valuable thing an institution could have and the most threatening. He had been asked to do something that no person should be asked to do. He had done it, not because he wanted to, because the alternative was worse, because he had looked at the full picture, the complete, honest, devastating full picture, and had understood that the cost he was being asked to pay was real and was enormous and was the only thing that prevented something even larger from breaking. He had paid it. He had carried it alone. Almost alone. He had met Inko before the mission, before the night that changed everything. Not before everything, he had been carrying the weight of what was coming for years before that night, but before the specific execution of it, before the point of no return. She had been visiting the village, an exchange student, technically, from a program that officially did not exist between the ninja world and the emerging hero world. One of the early attempts at cross-system, understanding that both institutions would eventually deny had ever happened. She had been kind to him. Not because she knew what he was carrying. She didn't. Not because she understood the weight of it or had the full picture. Because he had been sitting alone in a place that was public enough to be safe, and she had sat nearby and had simply been present in a way that did not demand anything. She had offered him food from her lunch. He had accepted it. She had not asked about the weight. He had not explained it. They had talked about other things. About what it felt like to have a power you had not chosen. About the specific cost of excellence in worlds that needed excellence and did not ask whether you could afford it. About the distance between what institutions claimed to be and what they actually were. He had talked more honestly in that conversation than he had talked to anyone in 3 years. Not about the mission, never about the mission, about the underneath of it, the texture of what it cost to be what he was in the world he was in. She had listened with the complete attention of someone who genuinely heard what was being said. He had not forgotten that. He had not forgotten her. What came after was brief and real and impossible in the timeline that followed. The mission was already decided. The point of no return was already approaching. He had not allowed himself to have things that could be used against him, and he had not allowed himself to have things that could be hurt by what was coming. He had made an exception. Once, for the specific quality of someone who listened with complete attention and offered food from her lunch and did not ask about the weight. He had left before morning. He had known he would not come back. He had been right. Inko Midoriya returned to Japan, carrying something she had not anticipated. She did not tell anyone. Not because she was ashamed, not because the something was wrong. Because what she was carrying had come from a world that officially did not exist to anyone she knew, connected to a person whose name she could not safely say out loud, who had been the most extraordinary and most burdened human being she had ever met, and who she understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who was paying attention, was walking towards something he would not walk back from. She raised Izumi alone. She gave her the name Midoriya. She watched her grow into her notebooks and her star system, and the specific quality of attention that Inko recognized immediately and which was not from her side of the equation. The eyes were hers. Everything else was his. The precision of the observation, the way she processed things not just fast, but in multiple layers simultaneously, holding the whole picture and the individual details at the same time. The specific quality of competence that looked effortless because the effort was invisible, done internally before anything reached the surface. The capacity for sacrifice. Inko had watched that develop in her daughter, with the specific complicated feeling of someone who recognized something and understood its cost. She had not told her. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment. The right moment had not arrived before the world changed, and the moments available were different from the ones she had been waiting for. Izumi Midoriya was 16 years old when she got into UA. She was quirkless at the time, had been her whole life. That was what the tests said, what the doctors said, what the world had decided about her based on the visible surface of things. Quirkless. She had believed it. She had believed it and had grieved it, and had kept writing in the notebooks anyway, because the notebooks were not about the quirk. The notebooks were about the understanding. The understanding did not require the quirk. She had the highest rescue score in UACE, recorded history on the entrance exam. Not because of power, because she saw the whole room. All of it simultaneously. The current crisis and the developing crisis, and the person in the corner who was not in immediate danger, but whose panic was going to become secondary danger in approximately 40 seconds. She saw all of it. She responded to all of it. All for one transferred to her by the person who had been waiting for someone who understood sacrifice from the inside, who had the capacity for it not as a performance, but as a constitutional reality, activated in her body like it had been waiting for the correct architecture. It had been. She had been built for it. Not because of the quirk. Because of what she had inherited from someone who had understood, in a different world with different stakes, what it meant to carry something enormous for the sake of people you would never be thanked by. The notebooks on her father started in year 1. Not with his name. She didn't have his name yet. She had the feeling from notebook 1, the heavy secret that was not bad, and she had the specific quality of her own processing that she had begun to understand was not standard. She had been studying quirk analysis since she was 8. By the time she entered UA, she had a more complete framework for quirk inheritance and power transfer mechanics than most commission researchers. She had been applying that framework to herself for 3 years. The conclusions were in Notebook 16. Notebook 16 was the one she kept differently from the others, not hidden exactly, placed with the specific care of something that contained information she was not ready to act on yet. She had written on the first page, what I know about where I came from. She had written on the second page, what I cannot explain through the documented side of my family. She had written on the third page, the processing style is not hers, not all for one's either. I've read everything on the previous holders and the style doesn't match any of them. The style predates the quirk in me, which means it predates UA, which means it's mine inherently. She had written, inherited inherently from somewhere. She had written, the somewhere is the heavy secret. She had written, I'm going to find it. She had been right. She was always right eventually. It just took longer when the information had been deliberately kept from her. Shigaraki found out on a Tuesday. Not through surveillance, not through commission intelligence or league information, gathering or any of the operational channels that the villain world used to build its picture of the hero world. He found out because All for One told him. Not the current All for One, the sealed one, the diminished one operating through Tamura's body in ways that were getting more complicated by the month. The original, the memory of him that lived in the quirk's accumulated history. He found out because All for One had known. Had known for years. Had known when he chose her as the successor. Had known that the girl he was giving everything to was not who the world thought she was. Had known and had chosen her anyway. Had possibly, and this was the part that Shigaraki sat with for a long time, in the specific internal quiet of someone processing something enormous, chosen her because of it. The information arrived in Shigaraki's consciousness on a Tuesday during a training session when the connection between himself and the remnant of All for One's presence in his quirk was particularly strong. It arrived like most significant information arrived, not as an announcement, not as a presentation, but as a knowing. A thing that was suddenly simply known where it had not been known before. He stopped the training session. He sat down. He thought Midoriya Izumi is Itachi Uchiha's daughter. He thought All For One knew. He thought All For One knew and chose her anyway. He thought about what that meant. He thought about it for a very long time. Here is what Shigaraki knew about Itachi Uchiha that the hero world did not know. The hero world knew Itachi Uchiha the way the hero world knew most things from the ninja world, incompletely, through the filtered version that the cross-system documentation had produced, through the official record, which was as accurate as official records tended to be, which was to say, partially. The official record said Itachi Uchiha, shinobi, classified, deceased. That was the whole official record. Shigaraki knew more. Not because of the leg, because of All For One. All For One had been watching both worlds for a very long time, long enough to have a complete picture of things that official records reduced to 3 words. What All For One's memory held, what Shigaraki had now inherited the knowing of, was this. Itachi Uchiha had been the most complete person either system had ever produced. Not the most powerful, complete was a different measurement. It meant the specific alignment of capacity and ethics and the willingness to pay costs that the capacity and ethics required. Most people had capacity without ethics, or ethics without capacity, or both without the willingness to pay the costs. Itachi had all 3. And the world had used all 3 completely. Had used them past the point that should have been survivable. Had required him to sacrifice everything, including his name, his reputation, his health, and eventually his life for the sake of a system that would never acknowledge the sacrifice. He had paid it without making the sacrifice about himself. That was the complete part. Shigaraki sat with the Tuesday knowing and thought about what the daughter of Itachi Uchiha meant in the context of the war he was preparing. He thought about capacity and ethics and the willingness to pay costs. He thought about a girl who had broken her arms so many times, trying to be a hero, that Recovery Girl had a dedicated file. He thought about motivation unclear. He thought she doesn't know. He thought she has no idea where that willingness comes from. He thought, and I do. He thought about what to do with knowing something that the person it was about did not know. He thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he made a decision. He was going to tell her. Not as a weapon, not as leverage, not as the kind of information you deployed to destabilize someone before a confrontation. He was going to tell her because she deserved to know. He sat with that conclusion. He examined it from every angle. He could not find the flaw in it. He thought, that's either correct or I'm changing in ways I haven't examined yet. He thought probably both. He wrote nothing down, but he filed it. And he began working out how. She found the documentation in the same week. Not through him, she had been building toward it for 3 years, and the building reached the destination independent of his decision. She was in notebook 16. She had been adding to the what I cannot explain section for a year, and the section had grown into something that had its own weight. The processing style, the specific quality of her visual analysis, the way she could read a person's physical state through observation alone in a way that exceeded what One For All should have been producing. The natural aptitude for chakra-adjacent energy management that she had been knotting and not knowing what to call for 2 years. She had finally called it something. She had written, the energy management style is not a quirk derivative. It's a separate system, running parallel to One For All rather than through it, inherited rather than transferred. She had written, the ninja world's chakra system and the hero world's quirk system have documented interaction points in 3 independent research papers that the Commission buried in 1987, 1994, and 2003 respectively. I found all 3. She had written, chakra is not inherited through quirk mechanics, it's inherited through bloodline. She had written, I have a bloodline that's not on any document I've ever accessed. She had written, the heavy secret. She had drawn a star. She had looked at the star. She had written, I need to talk to my mother. The conversation with Inko happened on a Saturday morning. She made tea first, both of them, the specific domestic ritual of someone who understood that some conversations required the ordinary thing to be happening while the large thing was said. She put the tea on the table. She sat across from her mother. She said, I need to ask you something direct. And I need you to tell me the truth, even if the truth is the heavy secret. Inko looked at her. She said, "The heavy secret." She said, "You know about the heavy secret." Izumi said, "I've known something was there since I was 7. It's in Notebook 1. Inko said, "You wrote about it in Notebook 1. Izumi said, "I write about everything." Inko said, "Yes." She said, "Yes, you do." She looked at her tea. She looked at her daughter. She said his name was Itachi Uchiha. Izumi was very still. Inko told her. All of it. The exchange program, the village, the conversation that was more honest than either of them had planned, what came after, the morning he left, what she understood about where he was going even though he had not said it. She told her about what she had learned afterward, the fragments of information she had been able to gather through the buried cross-system channels, the specific shape of what Itachi had done and what it had cost and what it had been for. She told her about the eyes, about the processing style, about watching her daughter grow into something she recognized. She told her everything. Izumi listened. She did not write, she was not at the analysis speed or the processing speed, or even the third speed. She was just listening. When her mother finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He did it for other people." Inko said, "Yes." Izumi said, "And they never knew." Inko said, "Some of them found out later, not all." Izumi said, "He paid everything and most of them never knew." Inko said, "Yes." Izumi said, "And he did it anyway." Inko said, "Yes." Izumi said, "Because the alternative was worse." Inko said, "Because he looked at the full picture and understood what the cost prevented." Izumi said, "Yes." She said, "That's." She stopped. She said, "That's in my processing. That's how I process things, the full picture and what the cost prevents." Inko said, "Yes." Izumi said, "I thought it was the notebooks." Inko said, "The notebooks are yours. The processing underneath was always his." Izumi looked at her tea. She said, "I want to know more." Inko said, "I know." She said, "I want the full picture." Inko said, "I'll tell you everything I know." She said, "And the things you don't know." Inko looked at her. Izumi said, "The commission buried 3 research papers. I found them. There are channels I can access. I can find the rest." Inko said, "Izumi." Izumi said, "He looked at the full picture." She said, "I want to look at the full picture too." Inko was quiet. She said, "Yes." She said, "I know." She said, "You always do." She opened Notebook 17 on Sunday morning. She wrote at the top, Itachi Uchiha. She wrote under it, my father. She wrote under that, what I know, what I'm going to find out, what it means. She looked at the 3 lines. She kept them all. She drew a star. She drew 6 more. 7. She looked at 7 stars. She wrote 7, 1 for the heavy secret being real, 1 for my mother's honesty, 1 for the processing style that was always his, 1 for the buried research papers, 1 for the full picture, 1 for what the cost prevents, 1 for the beginning of understanding where I came from. She looked at the 7 stars. She said, "Yes." That's right. The first contact from Shigaraki came 3 weeks later. Not in person, not through the league, through a channel that should not have existed, but which Shigaraki had spent considerable operational effort building specifically for this purpose. A letter, handwritten, specific, with the quality of someone who had thought very carefully about every word. It said, "I know something about your father that you are in the process of finding out. I'm not going to use it. I'm telling you I know because you deserve to know that someone else knows, and because what I know changes some of what I understood about this war. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not offering a deal. I'm telling you that Tamura Shigaraki read a Tuesday knowing and spent 3 days figuring out what to do with it, and decided that the person it was about deserved to have the information instead of having it used against them. If you want to talk, you know how to find me. If you don't, I understand that too." She read it twice. She put it on her desk. She sat with it. She thought about the full picture. She thought about what she had been building in Notebook 17. She thought about capacity and ethics and the willingness to pay costs. She thought, he knows. She thought, and he wrote a letter instead of using it. She thought about what that meant. She wrote in Notebook 17, Shigaraki knows. He sent a letter. The letter does not ask for anything. The letter says he decided the person it was about deserved to have the information. That's a specific kind of decision. I'm going to think about what kind. She thought about it for a week. She wrote back. The exchange that followed was the strangest thing she had ever documented. Not a meeting, not yet. Letters, moving through the specific careful channel that Shigaraki had built, back and forth, each one more honest than the one before. She asked, what did the knowing tell you about him? He wrote back that he was the most complete person either system had produced. Capacity and ethics and the willingness to pay costs, all three simultaneously. The world used all three until there was nothing left to use. She asked, does that change the war for you? He wrote, I've been thinking about that for 3 weeks. Yes, I don't know how yet. She asked, why? He wrote, because I've been operating on the premise that the hero system is what it is, and the people inside it are products of what it is. Your father was inside a system, and was also completely different from what the system produced. That complicates the premise. She wrote, he was inside it, and he was also trying to change it from inside. The sacrifice was for something better, not for the system as it was. He wrote, yes, I understand that now. She wrote, what do you want? He wrote, I told you, nothing. I wanted you to know I knew and to not have it used against you. She wrote, why? A longer pause this time. She could feel the pause in the handwriting of the response, the specific quality of someone who had written several versions and sent the most accurate one. He wrote, because you inherited something real from someone who paid everything for something real. And using that as a weapon would be the specific kind of wrong that I find I cannot do anymore. She read that 3 times. She wrote in Notebook 17, he says he cannot do the specific kind of wrong that using this would be. I believe him. I don't know what to do with believing him. She wrote, the full picture keeps getting fuller. She drew a star. They met in week 6. Neutral location, her choice, daylight. She had her notebooks and one for all and 17 years of preparation, and the processing style she had inherited from someone who had walked into impossible rooms and seen the whole of them. He came alone. She came alone. They sat across from each other. She said, you look different from the threat assessments. He said, you look different from the surveillance. She said, the surveillance. He said, yes. She said, of course. She said, you have notebooks on me. He said, not notebooks, documentation, it's different. She said, how? He said, notebooks have a star system. She looked at him. He said, I read about the star system, from a source. She said, which source? He said, the letter you sent in week 3, you mentioned the star system. She said, I mentioned it in passing. He said, I pay attention to things in passing. She said, yes. She said, I know you do. She said, the threat assessments were accurate about that part. He said, the threat assessments on me. She said, 17 notebooks on you currently, you have your own section in 4 others. He said, 17. She said, you're the most significant single structural factor in the current arrangement. Of course there are 17. He said, and what do they say? She said, they say you've been changing. He said, yes. She said, they don't fully explain why. He said, no. She said, can you? He said, I'm working on explaining it to myself first. She said, that's honest. He said, yes. She said, I appreciate honest. He said, I know, it's in the notebooks. She said, of course it is. They sat. The neutral location was quiet around them. He said, your father. She said, yes. He said, the complete picture, what all for one's knowing gave me. She said, tell me. He said, the specific thing that he understood that most people in either system never understood. She said, what? He said that the sacrifice being invisible is not the same as the sacrifice being wrong. She said, yes. He said, most people need the acknowledgement, need the knowing that they did it. He didn't. She said, no. He said, because the thing he was doing it for was real enough. She said, yes. He said, the real enough is the thing. She said, yes. She said, I've been thinking about the real enough my whole career. He said, and me. She said, "You've been building towards something real enough too." He said, "Yes." He said, "I think I've been building toward the wrong version of it." She said, "What's the right version?" He said, "I don't know completely." He said, "I think it might be in the letters." She said, "The exchange." He said, "Yes." She said, "The part where you decided not to use what you knew." He said, "Yes." She said, "That felt more real than the mission." He said, "Yes." He said, "That's the part I've been sitting with." She opened notebook 17. She wrote while he watched. He said, "The third speed." She looked up. He said, "The pen speed, that's the third one, the one that moves towards something." She said, "You know about the pen speeds." He said, "I told you, I pay attention to things in passing." She said, "From the letters." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you learned the speed system from one mention." He said, "The speed system is accurate. Accurate things are worth knowing completely." She looked at him. She said, "You sound like the notebooks." He said, "Is that bad?" She said, "No." She said, "It's accurate." He said, "Yes." He said, "It is." She wrote in the notebook. He sat across from her. The neutral location held them. Two people building towards something from opposite directions and finding, in the specific honest quality of the exchange between them, that the directions were not as opposite as either system had required them to be. She wrote, "He said the sacrifice being invisible is not the same as it being wrong. My father understood that. I've been understanding it without knowing where the understanding came from." She wrote, "Now I know where it came from." She wrote, "And I think the person across from me might be beginning to understand it too." She wrote, "The full picture keeps getting fuller." She drew a star. She drew 6 more. She looked at 7. She said, "Yes." She said, "That's right." He said, "How many?" She said, 7. He said, "For what?" She said, "The full picture, the exchange, the letter instead of the weapon, the real enough, the processing that was always his, the invisible sacrifice, and this." He said, "This." She said, "Yes." He said, "This gets a star." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because it's real." She said, "And the real things always get stars." He was quiet. He said, "Your father." She said, "Yes." He said, "If he were here." She said, "Yes." He said, "What do you think he would say about all of this?" She thought about it. She thought about capacity and ethics and the willingness to pay costs, about the invisible sacrifice and the real enough, about walking into impossible rooms and seeing the whole of them. She said, "I think he would say look at the full picture." She said, "I think he would say the real enough is the thing." She said, "And I think he would say the sacrifice being invisible is not the same as it being wrong." She said, "And then I think he would not say anything else." She said, "Because he never needed the rest of it." Shigaraki looked at her. He said, "No." He said he wouldn't. He said, "Would you?" She said, "I'm working on it." He said, "Yes." He said, "So am I." The location held them. The war was still happening outside it. The full picture was still developing. The notebooks were ongoing. The real enough was still being found. And two people who had been on opposite sides of an enormous thing sat across from each other and found, in the space between the letter and the response, and the 7 stars and the processing style that had been his all along, something that was not yet named but was building toward a name. Something that might, eventually, be worth the cost of what was coming. Something real enough. The 8th meeting was different from the first 7. Not the location. They had settled into the neutral location with the specific organic permanence of 2 people who had stopped questioning whether they were going to meet and had started treating the meeting as the given that it had become. Not the notebooks, she always had them. He had started expecting them the way you expected weather, not as a surprise, as a condition. What was different was what she brought. She put it on the table between them before she sat down. A photograph. Old, the specific quality of something that had been handled carefully for years, not worn from carelessness, but from the specific careful handling of something precious. A man, young, the specific quality of someone who carried enormous things invisibly. Dark eyes with a depth in them that photographs rarely captured, but which this one had caught in a specific unguarded moment. She sat down. She said, "My mother had one photograph." He looked at it. He said nothing. She said, "I've been looking at it for 3 weeks, trying to find the processing in it, the way the observation worked, the specific quality of looking at the whole room." He said, "And?" She said, "It's in the eyes." He said, "Yes." She said, "The eyes are doing it even in the photograph, even in the still image, you can see the whole room quality." He said, "Yes." He said, "I can see it." She said, "You've seen eyes like that before?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Where?" He said, "Across this table." She looked at him. He said, "Same eyes, different face, same thing happening in them." She said, "The processing." He said, "The whole room quality, yes." She picked up the photograph. She looked at it. She said, "I never knew him." He said, "No." She said, "And he never knew about me." He said, "No." She said, "And the people he did everything for mostly never knew what he did." He said, "Yes." She said, "And he did it anyway." He said, "Yes." She said, "The invisible sacrifice." He said, "Yes." She said, "I've been thinking about the invisible sacrifice since our 4th meeting." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I've been thinking about whether I could do it." He said, "Sacrifice something that nobody would ever acknowledge." She said, "Sacrifice something that nobody would ever know about, not just not acknowledge, not know, the complete invisibility." He said, "And?" She said, "I think I could." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know." She said, "You sound certain." He said, "I'm looking at the eyes." She said, "The whole room quality." He said, "The whole room quality includes the part where you've already calculated the cost and accepted it." She said, "You can see that." He said, "Yes." She said, "In the eyes." He said, "In the eyes, yes." She put the photograph on the table. She looked at him. She said, "Shigaraki." He said, "Yes." She said, "What have you accepted?" Long pause. He said that the version of the mission I've been running is wrong. She said, "Wrong how?" He said, "The destruction direction. The architecture of what comes after has been, I've been building toward an ending without a beginning, what you called the rubble direction." She said, "Yes." He said, "The rubble direction doesn't have the real enough in it." She said, "No." He said, "I found the real enough in a different direction." She said, "The letters." He said, "The exchange, the deciding not to use what I knew, the thing that felt more real than the mission." She said, "And now?" He said, "And now I have to figure out what you do when the thing that feels most real is incompatible with the direction you've been running for years." She said, "That's the hardest part." He said, "Yes." She said, "My father knew that." He said, "Yes." She said, "He ran a direction for years that looked wrong from outside. The visible version of him was the wrong version. The real direction was inside it." He said, "The sacrifice being invisible." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you think?" She said, "I think the direction you've been running has a visible version and a real version. And I think the real version is not the destruction." He said, "And what is it?" She said, "I think you've been trying to build something real enough, and the destruction was the only tool the framework gave you." He said, "And if there were different tools?" She said, "Then the real enough could look different." He was quiet. He said, "You're describing a direction I don't have a map for." She said, "No." She said, "But I have notebooks." She brought notebook 17 to meeting 9. The whole thing, not excerpts. The complete 17 notebook documentation on him, his development, the league, the framework, the costs, the changes she had been observing across the months of exchange. She put it on the table. She said, "Read it." He said, "All of it." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's." She said, "Everything I know about you, that's accurate, the full picture from my angle." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because the exchange has been running for 6 weeks, and I've been building the picture, and you deserve to see the picture." He said, "You're giving me your documentation on me." She said, "Yes." He said, "Most people wouldn't." She said, "I'm not most people." He said, "No." He said, "You're not." He looked at the notebooks. He picked up the first one. He read. She watched him read. Not intrusively, the peripheral attention, the whole room quality that saw what it needed to see without requiring him to perform the reading for her. He read for a long time. He read with the specific quality of someone encountering accurate information about themselves for the first time, not the Commission's version, not the League's version, not the story either system had built around him. The accurate version. The inside of it. He said, after the second notebook, "You wrote that the framework I was given organized everything around the wrong support point." She said, "Yes." He said, "The wrong load-bearing element." She said, "Yes." He said, "And the right one." She said, "Is in what felt more real than the mission." He said, "The exchange." She said, "Yes." He read the third notebook. He read the fourth. In the fifth notebook, he found the section she had written the week before the first meeting, the section where she had written about the Tuesday knowing and what she thought it meant about him. He said, "You wrote this before we met." She said, "Yes." He said, "You had already concluded." She said that the knowing being used as a letter rather than a weapon was evidence of something changing. Yes. He said, in a notebook before the first meeting. She said, "Accurate documentation anticipates the direction." He said, "You anticipated this direction." She said, "I had evidence, I followed the evidence." He said, "And the evidence said." She said that the person who sent the letter was already moving away from the wrong load-bearing element, even if they didn't know it yet. He said, "I didn't know it yet." She said, "No." He said, "And you could see it anyway." She said, "The eyes see the whole room, including the parts that aren't visible yet." He put the fifth notebook down. He looked at her. He said, "Your father." She said, "Yes." He said, "Did he know when things were changing before they changed?" She said, "Everything I've been able to find suggests yes." He said, "And he walked into it anyway." She said, "Yes." He said, "Knowing the cost." She said, "Knowing the cost completely." He said, "And he didn't." She said, "He didn't look for the exit." No. He said, "Because the real enough." She said, "Because the real enough." He looked at the notebooks. He said, the real enough for him was the people who would live because of what he did. She said, "Yes." He said, "Even though they'd never know." She said, "Yes." He said, "And for you?" She said, "The real enough for me is the same thing in a different configuration." He said, "And for me?" She said, "I think you're still finding it." He said, "Yes." He said, "I think I'm getting closer." She said, "Yes." She said, "I know." Meeting 10 was when everything outside accelerated. She arrived at the neutral location with the specific quality of someone who had been moving fast for 3 days and was using the meeting as the moment to stop and think rather than a reprieve from the movement. She put 4 notebooks on the table. She said, "The war is moving." He said, "Yes." She said, "I know." He said, "You have intelligence." She said, "I have documentation. The intelligence is in the documentation." He said, "Tell me what you know." She said, "The commission is moving on the leg in 10 days, full operation. They've been building the positioning for 2 months, and the positioning is now complete." He said, "How accurate is that?" She said, "The documentation goes back 8 weeks. I verified through 3 independent channels. It's accurate." He said, 10 days. She said, "Yes." He said, "And you're telling me?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because the people in the League are people, with real insides that the system has never looked at. And a full operation in 10 days means costs that don't need to be paid if the direction changes before the operation." He said, "You're giving me commission intelligence." She said, "I'm giving you accurate information that affects people who deserve to have accurate information affect them." He said, "That's going to have consequences for you." She said, "Yes." He said, "Significant ones." She said, yes. He said, and you're? She said, I'm looking at the full picture. He said, and the full picture says. She said, that 10 days is enough time if the direction changes now. He said, changes how? She said, the league stops being what it currently is. He said, that's not simple. She said, no. He said, people have built their lives in it. She said, I know. He said, the ideology. She said, the ideology was built around the wrong load-bearing element. You've known that since week 4. He said, knowing it and dismantling it are different. She said, yes. She said, I know. She said, 10 days. He said, and what happens after? She said, that's in notebook 17, the architecture section. He said, the what comes after architecture? She said, the building instead of the rubble. Yes. He said, show me. She opened notebook 17 to the architecture section. She showed him. He read it the same way he read everything she showed him, completely, from the inside out, with the processing that was accurate enough to make her recognize something she had been documenting for weeks. He processed the way she processed. Not identically, from different starting points, but the same fundamental quality. The full picture held simultaneously with the individual details. She had written about this in notebook 17, without fully understanding what she was writing about. She understood it now. He said, this is. She said, the building direction, yes. He said, it requires dismantling what the league currently is. She said, yes. He said, and replacing it with. She said, with what the people in it actually need, which is not the ideology. The ideology was the available framework, the need underneath it is separate. He said, the inside. She said, yes. He said, you've been looking at the insides. She said, yes. He said, of all of them. She said, all the ones I've been able to document. Yes. He said, and what do the insides say? She said, they say the league provided belonging when nothing else did, and belonging is real and worth providing. The method the league used to provide it cost things it didn't need to cost. He said, a different method. She said, yes. He said, for the same real need. She said, yes. He said, that's the architecture. She said, that's the foundation. The architecture builds from there. He said, 10 days. She said, yes. He said, I need to think. She said, I know. He said, this is the most significant decision I've ever made. She said, yes. She said, I know. He said, and you're giving me 10 days to make it. She said, I'm giving you the accurate information. The decision is yours. He said, with the full picture. She said, always with the full picture. He looked at the architecture section. He looked at the photograph on the table. She had left it there, between them, the way she left significant things, not pointing at them, just available. He said, the invisible sacrifice. She said, yes. He said, your father chose the direction that nobody would ever know was his direction. She said, yes. He said, and it worked, what he did worked. She said, yes. He said, and nobody knew. She said, until much later, and not everyone then. He said, and it was still worth it. She said, yes. He said, because the real enough. She said, because the real enough, yes. He looked at the photograph. He said he would have had a notebook for this. She said he kept meticulous records, different from mine, but yes. He said, and the record would have said. She said, the full picture, the cost it prevents, the real enough. He said, yes. He said, okay. She said, okay. He said, I need the 10 days. She said, yes. He said, all of them. She said, yes. He said, and at the end of them. She said, yes. He said, I'm going to do something that looks wrong from outside. She said, yes. He said, and is right from inside. She said, yes. He said, the invisible version. She said, yes. He said, and you'll know the real version. She said, I'll document it. He said in the notebooks. She said in the notebooks, yes. He said with stars. She said with as many as it earns. He said, how many does the direction change earn? She looked at him. She said, I'll count them when it happens. He said, and if it's a lot? She said, it'll be a lot. He said, okay. He said, okay. He stood up. He looked at the photograph. He said, can I? She said, yes. He picked it up. He looked at it. He put it back. He said, the whole room quality. She said, yes. He said, it's the same in yours. She said, I know. He said, you always knew. She said, yes. He said, but now you know where it came from. She said, yes. He said, and now I know too. She said, yes. He said, and knowing where it came from. She said, yes. He said, doesn't change it. She said, no. He said, it just. She said, makes the full picture fuller. He said, yes. He said, that's it exactly. He walked to the door. He said, Izumi. Her name's not Midoriya, not the hero name, it's her name. She said, yes. He said, the exchange. She said, yes. He said, it's in the notebooks. She said, yes. He said, which section? She said, its own section. It doesn't fit in any of the existing categories. He said, what's the title? She said, The Real Enough. He said, yes. He said, that's right. He left. She sat at the table. She picked up the photograph. She looked at her father's eyes. She said quietly, I'm looking at the full picture. She said, I think you would have too. She said, I think you would have seen what I'm seeing. She put the photograph in notebook 17. Not at the back, at the front. First page. She looked at it there. She wrote beside it, the whole room quality, inherited, real, ongoing. She drew a star. The 10 days passed. She documented them. Every day, the movements of the commission's positioning, the internal state of the league as best she could read it from outside, the specific quality of the weighting that the 10 days contained. On day 7, something happened that she had not calculated for. Toga found her. Not at the neutral location. At UA outside the dormitory at 6 in the morning, with the specific quality of someone who had been making a decision for a long time and had arrived at the end of the making. Toga said, you've been meeting with him. She said, yes. Toga said, I know. She said, I know you know. Toga said, the league knows. She said, I know. Toga said, and you're still. She said, yes. Toga said, why? She said, because the exchange is real and real things don't stop because they're complicated. Toga looked at her. She said, the inside. She said, you're looking at the inside. Toga said, of who? She said, of the leg, of everyone in it, including you. Toga said, and what do you see? She said, I see what the league provided that nothing else did, and I see what it cost. And I see that the cost was not necessary, that the provision is real and could have happened differently. Toga said, belonging. She said, yes. Toga said, and the belonging. She said, is real regardless of the method. Toga said, you think the method was wrong. She said, I think the method was the available framework, and I think the available framework is changing. Toga said, because of the exchange. She said, because of the direction the exchange is pointing. Toga said, and if the direction? She said, then the belonging doesn't have to come with the cost it's been coming with. Toga was very still. She said, you've been thinking about this. Toga said, yes. She said, since when? Toga said, since he sent the letter instead of using the weapon. She said, yes. She said, me too. Toga said, he's different. She said, yes. Toga said, since when? She said, I think he's been different for a while. The letter was the first visible evidence of the difference. Toga said, and the exchange? She said, has been building the evidence since. Toga said, 17 notebooks. She said, yes. Toga said, about him. She said, yes. Toga said, and. She said, and others. She said, including you. Toga said, I have a notebook. She said, you have a section, you've had one since first year. Toga said, what does it say? She said, it says the classification error that the world made about you is one of the most significant in the documented cases, and that the volume being all the way up is not a disorder. Toga was very still. She said, and it says that the belonging you found in the league was real even if the framework around it cost things it didn't need to cost. Toga said, and if the framework changes? She said, then you keep the belonging. Toga said, without the cost? She said, yes. Toga said, that's what the architecture is. She said, yes. She said, that's the foundation of it. Toga said, okay. She said, okay. Toga said, I'll talk to the others. She said, I know. Toga said, some of them won't listen. She said, I know. Toga said, but some will. She said, yes. She said, some will. Toga looked at her. She said, you have the whole room quality. Izumi said, yes. Toga said, I noticed it in first year. She said, I know, it's in your section. Toga said, everything is in a section. She said, everything real is in a section. Toga said, and this? She said, this is in the real enough section. Toga said, how many stars? She said, I'm still counting. Toga said, that means a lot. She said, yes. She said, it does. Day 10. She went to the neutral location. He was already there. This had not happened before, he had always arrived after. The arriving first was new information. She sat down. She said, you've made the decision. He said, yes. She said, tell me. He said, the league is going to dissolve. She said, yes. He said, not because of the commission operation, before it, on our terms, not theirs. She said, yes. He said, the people who want to go to the architecture, the building direction, there's a pathway. She said, yes. He said, you built it. She said, with the notebooks, yes. He said, and the people who don't. She said, yes. He said, they make their own choices, with full information. She said, yes. He said, and me. She said, yes. He said, I'm going to do the thing that looks wrong from outside. She said, yes. He said, and is right from inside. She said, yes. He said, the commission is going to get a confession. She was very still. He said, not a complete one, a strategic one, the version that accounts for what needs to be accounted for and protects what needs to be protected. She said, you're going to walk in. He said, yes. She said, voluntarily. He said, yes. She said, that's. He said, the invisible version, yes. He said, the version where what I'm actually doing is not visible from outside. She said, because from outside it looks like surrender. He said, and from inside. She said, from inside it's the architecture, the beginning of the building instead of the rubble. He said, yes. She said, you're using yourself as the foundation. He said, yes. He said, the foundation has to hold the building up. She said, yes. She said, I know. He said, and the building is. She said, the architecture, what the League's people actually needed, the belonging without the cost. He said, and Toga. She said, yes. He said, she'll build it. She said, with the pathway. He said, yes. He said, and you. She said, I'll document it. He said, from inside. She said, from wherever I need to be, yes. He said, and if the commission. She said, I'll handle the commission. He said, you told me you gave them commission intelligence. She said, yes. He said, and you haven't been removed. She said, no. He said, because. She said, because Aizawa is on the load-bearing list, and Aizawa is managing the commission conversation. He said, the load-bearing list. She said, the people who can hold the weight of accurate information. He said, am I on it? She looked at him. She said, you have been since the letter. He said, since the letter. She said, the letter was the first evidence. The section started then. He said, and now? She said, and now you're not in a section anymore. He said, where am I? She said, you have your own notebook. He said, 17. She said, 17, yes. He said, and what does 17 say? She said, everything. She said, the full picture from my angle. He said, the whole room quality. She said, yes. He said, everything it saw. She said, everything. He said, and the last entry. She said, I haven't written it yet. He said, when? She said, after today. He said, what will it say? She thought about it. She thought about her father and the invisible sacrifice, and the real enough and the load-bearing elements, and the both things held simultaneously. She thought about the letter that arrived instead of a weapon. She thought about 17 notebooks and 7 stars and the photograph on the first page. She said, it will say that the full picture keeps getting fuller, and that the fuller it gets the more real the real enough becomes, and that the person across the table looked at the photograph and saw the whole room quality and named it accurately. She said, and that naming things accurately is the closest thing to love I know how to write about. He was quiet. He said, the closest thing to love. She said, yes. He said, you write about love carefully. She said, I write about everything carefully. He said, yes. He said, you do. He said, Izumi. She said, yes. He said, the photograph. She said, yes. He said, he paid everything and most of them never knew. She said, yes. He said, and it was still worth it. She said, yes. He said, because the people who lived because of it were real. She said, yes. He said, and I'm going to do something that most people will never understand. She said, yes. He said, and it's going to be worth it. She said, yes. He said, because the building is real. She said, yes. He said, and the people who get to live in it are real. She said, yes. He said, and you'll document it. She said, every word. He said, with stars. She said, with as many as it earns. He said, how many? She opened notebook 17. She turned to the last blank page. She looked at it. She drew stars. She drew them slowly, counting as she went. She stopped at 21. She looked at the 21 stars. She said, 21. He said, why 21? She said, one for each meeting, one for the letter, one for the Tuesday knowing being used the right way, one for the photograph and what you saw in it, one for the architecture, one for Toga and the belonging, one for the 10 days, one for the foundation being you, one for the building being real, one for the last entry not being written yet, and one for the ongoing. He said, 21. She said, yes. He said, that's a lot. She said, yes. He said, is that right? She looked at the 21 stars. She said, yes. She said, that's right. He stood. He looked at the table, the notebooks, the photograph on the first page of 17. He said, your father. She said, yes. He said, I'm going to try to be worth the whole room quality. She said, yes. He said, in the invisible version. She said, yes. He said, and you'll know the real version. She said, I'll document it. He said, 21 stars. She said, 21. He said, okay. He walked to the door. He stopped. He said, the real enough. She said, yes. He said, I found it. She said, I know. He said, it's the building. She said, yes. He said, and the people in it. She said, yes. He said, and the exchange. She said, yes. He said, and 17 notebooks. She said, yes. He said, and you knowing the real version. She said, yes. He said, that's the real enough. She said, yes. She said, that's everything. He said, yes. He left. She sat at the table with the photograph and the 21 stars and the last entry not written yet. She picked up the pen. She wrote the last entry. She wrote meeting 10, the decision made, the direction chosen, the invisible version beginning. She wrote, he said the real enough is the building and the people in it, and the exchange and 17 notebooks, and me knowing the real version. She wrote, I'm writing the real version. She wrote, it says this. It says that the full picture includes a man who looked at a photograph and named the whole room quality accurately, who received a Tuesday knowing and sent a letter instead of a weapon, who looked at the inside when the system had never looked at anything except the surface, who found the real enough and walked toward it even though the walking was going to look wrong from outside. She wrote, it says that the load-bearing element of the real enough is not the power or the mission or the system. She wrote, it's the decision to build instead of burn. She wrote, it's the invisible version being the right version. She wrote, it's the namming of the whole room quality. She wrote, it's the 21 stars. She looked at what she had written. She wrote one more line. She wrote, this is the last entry in Notebook 17. She wrote, Notebook 18 begins now. She wrote the real enough, ongoing. She looked at the 3 lines. She kept all 3. She looked at the photograph. She said, I'm looking at the full picture. She said, I think you would recognize it. She drew one more star. 22. She looked at it. She wrote beside it one more, for the ongoing, because the ongoing always earns its star. She closed Notebook 17. She opened Notebook 18. She wrote at the top, the building. She wrote under it, from the real enough. She wrote under that, ongoing, always. She looked at the 3 lines. She kept them. She began. And that is the complete story. Of Itachi Uchiha, who paid everything for something real and left a daughter, who inherited the whole room quality, and the invisible sacrifice, and the willingness to pay costs, and the capacity to look at the full picture. Of Izumi Midoriya, who had a heavy secret in Notebook 1 at age 7, and filled 17 notebooks, finding her way to the truth of where she came from. Of Tamura Shigaraki, who received a Tuesday knowing, and spent 3 days figuring out what to do with it, and sent a letter, and built the real enough out of what the letter started. Of 21 stars becoming 22. Of the invisible version being the right version. Of the building instead of the rubble. Of the load-bearing element being the decision to build. Of the real enough being found. Of Notebook 18 beginning. Of the ongoing being always. No cap, this is the most complete and layered story fiction Flux has ever told. And every notebook proved it. Every single one. If you made it to the very end of this complete story, you are absolutely Fiction Flux family, and we love you for being here for all of it. This one was massive and emotional and layered, and you stayed through every single part, and that means everything to us. Please subscribe and hit that like button and share this with every anime fan you know, because every single share helps us grow and reach more people who love stories like this one. Drop in the comments what part hit you hardest, because we genuinely want to know. Tell us what story you want next. See you in the next one.